Recording. Hey guys, it's Graham. Welcome back to Truckerman Reads. Got a little doodle for you right here on the board. Let's talk about Washington Irving. In 2021, I placed an order on Thrift Books. It's the first time that I used the site. I get a lot of cheap used books from there now. And I did an unboxing video here on the channel, and one of the books I got in that bundle was Washington Irving, an American Original by Brian J. Jones. This is the second book that I've read by Brian J. Jones. He also wrote a really good biography of George Lucas that I read last year. It made my best of year list, and I'll probably throw this one on the best of year list for 2025. I've talked at length about Irving before. He's one of my favorite writers. I've read a wide variety of his work, and next month I'm going to review a book that he wrote about Christmas. I've also got over here on the shelf the very, very abridged version of the biography that he wrote on George Washington. The real thing is like a 5-volume set. I have there the Charles Neater edition in paperback. That's one that I read for the video project that I did earlier this year. But Jones does a wonderful undertaking here of summarizing his life and showing where he was and what was going on when he wrote his best known works. Obviously, the one about George Washington is his most significant. Legend of Sleepy Hollow is his best known. But there's more to it than just those two. Obviously, he also wrote a biography of Christopher Columbus, and I learned from here that was his first real foray into nonfiction for a broad audience. Now, he had written some nonfiction before that. We'll get to all of that in a second. I wanted to kind of give you an overview of his life, what I learned from this book, and then offer my 2 cents on some of Jones's conclusions. So Washington Irving, he was the son of a church deacon. He was the younger son in a large family of children. He decided not to follow his father into a career in the clergy. But he and his brothers over time had a lot of different business adventures that they did together. They were, for the most part, pretty well off, but their finances, like anybody else at that time period, were up and down. And his especially were all over the map, usually having to do with his writing. And that's something that Jones emphasizes a lot throughout the course of the book, is that the major driving factor that made Irving sit down and actually finish a project was financial need. You know, he had the drive to be creative and to be productive and to be a writer, but unless he like had a dire financial need of doing so, he usually struggled to sit down and complete a project that was then commercially viable. It covers his early years going into to Europe. He spent some time over there on his brother's dime, and it annoyed his brother that he was speed running certain cities and skipping some major sites and stuff. And when I say taking a vacation, obviously this was not in the age of the internet. It's not like he was spending a day in Paris and another day in Rome. Like, he was there in these different cities for weeks and maybe even months at a time, and sending correspondence across the Atlantic and stuff. These trips would take years even. And if he wrote to his brother and said, "Hey, I'm only seeing this while I'm in this city, and then I'm going to go somewhere else," and his brother would get frustrated. He's like, "I paid for you to go over there and kind of be edified by this trip and learn from it. And while you're there, you can't just skip like the must see parts of it. You know, if I'm footing the bill, you got to do this right." There were issues of contention between him and his brothers, usually related to finance, but even whenever they came up big or they crashed out on an investment or a project that they were working on together, Washington Irving was big on saying that, you know, I'm not going to hold it against him. Like, the bond of brotherhood that we have is more important than money. And you know, God wrote this brotherhood between us, and I'm going to abide by that. I thought that was a really beautiful and valuable sentiment. And it was cool to see the different gems of wisdom that Jones dug up when he was covering his life. The first real project that he tackled that brought him notoriety was not the fictional stuff like the Sleepy Hollow and the Rip Van Winkle and all that. It was a history of New York that he wrote, because there was not such a history at the time. New York itself as a city and as a concept was rather novel in the early 1800s. Remember that leading up to the British colonization of New England and of the East Coast, the majority of New York had been controlled or settled by the Dutch. That whole bit about it used to be New Amsterdam, now it's New York, and there are still Dutch names and Dutch pockets of people in that region. Creating it as New York was a novel thing, and with the city being so significant and uniquely American, a history of it would have been really popular. He wrote that, and it brought him some acclaim and some notoriety, and it led to future successes after that. His most important fictional contributions came from the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gent, which was a pseudonym that he used. He also used a pseudonym Diedrich Knickerbocker, being a very Dutch name. He wrote under these pen names for a while. Later in life, when he had notoriety and popularity under his own name, he would even write stories where he was sitting in a room with Diedrich Knickerbocker and Geoffrey Crayon, and they would have discussions and arguments and stuff. It was, if some anon got unmasked and you saw him sitting in a chat room moving between his accounts and discussing things between themselves, but it was, that's what it would be like. But it was popular and it was endearing, and people liked knowing who he was. And when he felt like he had good enough writing chops, he didn't mind writing under his own name so much. But The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was published under a pseudonym in 1819 and 1820. The sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gent was a collection of, I believe it was 5 stories. That was his first foray into success, but it didn't immediately lead to an unbroken chain of writing projects after that. Nevertheless, Washington Irving was the first American man of letters to make a living at it, but there were other contemporaries who did so around the same time, James Fenimore Cooper being the most significant one. They had a professional relationship. Later, they had a falling out, but James Fenimore Cooper was there for his funeral and remembered him fondly later on. He was also a contemporary of Walter Scott, of Charles Dickens, and I did not know this, but obviously of Mary Shelley. And even when she was a young widow at 22, she was popular, she was attractive, she was established, and there were a lot of guys that wanted to court her after her period of mourning and everything. And even though Washington Irving didn't seek her out, she became familiar with him, and she had a crush on him for a while. And he didn't marry her, obviously, but they carried on a warm and friendly relationship for some time. Another thing that I didn't know and I thought was really cool was Washington Irving was the one that coined the nickname of Gotham for New York. There was some older tradition back in England where that word was used for something or other, but he was the one that specifically associated that word with New York City and with the residents being Gothamites. And 100 years later, Bob Kane would use that same name for the fictional city that Batman saves all the time. So I thought that was kind of cool. Throughout the rest of his career, he had, like I said, fluctuating degrees of success. And whenever he was down low and kind of getting low on funds and had debts and bills to pay off, usually because of merchant misadventures with his brothers or with other business partners, he would sit down and tackle a big project and sell it to American publishers and to English publishers and sell off copyrights and stuff, and get a big old mountain of money, settle his debts, and start the cycle all over again. This repeated over and over throughout his life. The History of New York, like I said, that one got him a reputation. The sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon gained him wider popularity, but the one that really gained significant critical and financial acclaim for him was his biography of the voyage, or not the voyage, the biography of Christopher Columbus. He covered the voyages of Christopher Columbus. And he spent a lot of time in Spain and in Europe doing research on that through old archives. He lived in Spain for a long time, and I think even more than once. Learned Spanish. He was there during several important events of the early to mid 1800s. That was really cool to read about. And then I think not total, but at one point he spent 17 years abroad over in Europe before he came back to America. And when he did, he was so well known from the popularity of his works that he was then able to kind of rub shoulders with different political figures, and he was well received and regularly received in the White House. He was an employee of the State Department when he went back to Europe later on. Just a fascinating life in business and in politics and in diplomacy and in literature, obviously. As I said before in my videos about the George Washington book, that was the last project that he tackled, and obviously the experience of writing about the history of New York and writing about Christopher Columbus, both of those were critical to him being able to satisfactorily tackle that book. But it took so much out of him physically and mentally that by the time he was finished, his health was shot. He died when he was 76 years old in 1859. And he had a nephew living with him who was kind of helping him, just take care of his day-to-day stuff. And he was up late. He'd wake up late in the middle of the night, haunted by being alone in his room, and just needed somebody to talk to. Like his mind was just going in 100 different directions, and he was so lost in this project and other writing projects that he wanted to tackle that he was just starting to kind of spiral psychologically. But that was the last project that he tackled before he died, and I think he might have died within a year of finishing it. And Jones even said that he would wake up in the middle of the night, like sweating, fearing that there was still some manuscript that he had to finish. He'd gone completely manic near the end, and he'd had health problems for decades leading up to that. But nevertheless, living to be 76 in the mid 1800s is no small feat. But he was committed to his craft, for better or worse. And was one thing that I did know going into it. He never married, never had children, and the first time that I read about that, I've got a compendium inside the house, like a complete works of Washington Irving. In the preface, it talks about that and even cites some of his old journal writings and letters that he wrote to a nephew of his who was considering becoming a professional writer. He says that a lot of it has to do with the fact that income was never steady, and writing was so taxing, and especially if you're worried about writing something that's going to sell or that people are going to respond positively to. It was such a gamble, and it was so difficult to manage as a profession that he discouraged his nephew from following in his footsteps. So I knew that he didn't have a progeny or anything, but he was still really close with his family and with his nieces and nephews and stuff. I think if there's one particular point that left me scratching my head that Jones came back to several times early on in the book, and he only touched on it once or twice later on, he says a lot that it's probable that Washington Irving was gay, which seems like a bit of a reach, taking the totality of the text into consideration. He was engaged once. The woman he was engaged to died before they got married. And we've got access to his journals and everything. We understand that that was a difficult thing for him, and it took him a while to kind of recuperate from that. And he had other liaisons later on with other women that he wanted to court and that he wanted to pursue. And he also had, early on in his 20s, several very close male friendships. And through things that Jones is able to extract, we'll say from letters and journals and stuff, he comes to what I feel is a bit of a reach of a conclusion that Washington Irving was a closeted homosexual, and that these close male friendships were more than that. Over on my shelf right here, I'm not going to go over there and grab it. I've got Ron Chernow's biography of Alexander Hamilton. I remember a similar claim or concern coming up in the preface to that when Chernow was talking about how difficult it was to summarize Alexander Hamilton's life. His widow, who I believe she lived into her 90s, she tried to find somebody to tackle the project using all of the resources and the writings and the documentation that she had from her husband's life. She tried to find somebody who could compile all that and put it together, and it was such a massive scope of a project that it resisted summarization, especially down into a single volume in the 1800s, for a very, very long time. He had a very well-documented life, and so putting it into a single book was going to be a massive challenge. But there were also correspondences from Alexander Hamilton's life that his kids wanted to kind of restrict from public access, some of them having to do with correspondence between Alexander Hamilton and his close male friends of his youth, specifically with the concern that some of the writings would come off as homoerotic. Not that they were necessarily like romantic or pornographic, but this man was like so close with these male friends of his that the way that he would express their value to him would sound gay. And so the family was like, okay, well, let's not put this out there. Hamilton's obviously he had his own contemporary detractors. He may even have some still today, and they would make hay out of that. So it's like, we'll just keep this particular element of it private within the family. From what Jones described, it sounds like there was a similar dynamic with his close male friendships, especially with a man named Brevoort, that he really, really valued these close male companions that he had throughout his life. He kept pursuing women, and there was one in particular, I've already forgotten her name, that he kept thinking that he was close to sealing the deal, and then there are entire pages that he scraped out of his journal after the fact because he was honest about his feelings with her and about how he felt when she rejected him, and he's just like, yeah, no, he was trying to bore it out of his mind how much that rejection hurt him. People can argue till they're blue in the face about all of that. I'm just going to again say that I've read biographies about contemporary men from the early 1800s, like Washington Irving, who had similar male friendships. It seems like a reach to take it that far. I will just recommend also that you guys read The Four Loves by C.S. Lewis. This modern 21st century bent that a lot of people have to say oh, you can't really love somebody unless you also want to have sex with them. That's ridiculous. There are different types of love, and male companionship amongst a certain class of men did not automatically result in homoeroticism. So that's probably the one point that I'll quibble with Jones on. Like I said, he came to that conclusion several times in the first third of the book. It only came up once again after that. It took him 6 years to write this. So I'm assuming that it was a supposition that he had early on, but as he went on, he saw less evidence for it and just didn't worry about it. That's my 2 cents. I think this is an incredible book. It's a very compelling look at one of my favorite writers, and it was fascinating to see where he was and what was going on in his life when he wrote the projects for which he is best known. And like I said, I find it interesting that without knowing, like, I've trod a lot of the same ground that he has. In addition to the time that I spent in Spain, he also came out here and took a tour of the prairies. I think I read that book several years ago. He was out here in Oklahoma, post Trail of Tears, pre-Civil War, to talk about what life was like out here in Oklahoma. And here in Oklahoma City and south of here, there are like schools and streets and stuff named after Washington Irving or named after Sleepy Hollow. Like the story that he wrote about life on the plains and took back to the East Coast, to the more established part of the country, was so well received and so endeared him so to the people here that they commemorate him with stuff like that to this day. So if you've never read anything by Washington Irving, definitely check out, obviously, Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Rip Van Winkle, all of that. For nonfiction, his biography on George Washington. I want to read his biography on Columbus now. And he also apparently wrote a couple of books about Muhammad, the Muslim figure. Anyway, I'm excited that there's still so much more of his work that I'll get to read in my lifetime. Like I said, I got that completed works of Washington Irving. I'm going to chip my way through that here and there. Until next time, I guess, check out Washington Irving, an American original by Brian J. Jones. Drive safe. See you out there.